Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Muhammad wa ahli bayti at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Okay, we're very privileged and honoured to have with us Reverend Dr. Richard Sudworth, who has been, I think we can firmly say, a friend of the Institute for a long time, has been coming and going to the Institute for a long time, and hopefully this seminar is the recommencement of increased relationship between one of his bases, which is the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Studies.
That's right.
Here in Birmingham, and inshallah, us here at the Al-Mahdi Institute. So Dr. Sudworth is an ordained Anglican priest. He splits his time between Queen's and an inner city parish ministry. So both the academia and the grassroots, as it were. His doctoral research was at Haythrop College at the University of London, and he looked at the political theology of the Church of England in response to Islam, the intersection of ecclesiology, politics and the public square. The Reverend is particularly interested in these issues, and hopefully we'll hear from him now a little bit more about, I'm guessing this is, some of this stuff is as a result of the
Indeed.
PhD.
Yeah.
So Christian responses to the political challenge of Islam.
Great,
Please.
thank you. Shall I stand? Is that,
Feel
what's the best way in terms of you filming? Well, I'll stand then, is that all right? First of all, salam alaikum. Thank you for the very warm welcome. It's a privilege for me to be here, and interesting to see this building in a new life. I remember it when it was a training institute at the Church of the Ascension, so it's good that it's not become a carpet warehouse or a bingo hall. Yeah, thank you for your welcome. Do you mind if I pray before I start? Would that be okay? And if you feel able to agree with the prayer, you can say Amen, Amen. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Great. What I want to do is really just give an overview of three contemporary responses to Islam in the public square. It would be fair to say that in Christian theology, the area of what we call political theology, public theology, is a very current and very kind of vital and vibrant debate. And the reality is that one of the key presenting issues has been the growing profile of Islam publicly. And I don't know if you recall, but editors of The Economist magazine just prior to the millennium produced an edition that pronounced God is dead at the kind of end of the 20th century. Those same editors published a book with some cheek, I may add, last year called God is Back. And I guess we'd all be united in acknowledging that God never went away, but it's just that some people are beginning to notice that these funny religious people, whether they be Christians, Muslims or whatever shape and size, are around and making their presence felt in good, indifferent and negative ways in all our faiths. So how Christian theologians are responding to the particular challenge of Islam is what I'm going to share a little bit of, and it'd be great, this is an overview of some of the Christian debates. Really welcome a kind of robust engagement as well. So what you find difficult or strange, could be really interesting as we have questions and answers at the end. Okay, where are my arrows to the right? No, not that one. Oh yeah, great. Just to set the scene, in lots of the Christian literature reflecting on Islam, a phrase that's commonly used, and I'll refer to Kenneth Cragg quite a bit in this presentation, is that the will to power. And Kenneth Cragg, who was bishop in the Anglican Church, and I guess would be described as an Arabist and a scholar of Islam. He worked in the Middle East for a number of years, learnt Arabic, and I think his corpus of works and publications, he died last year at the age of 99, stand as probably one of the most profound Christian accounts of Islamic theology that one can read. His classic book being The Call of the Minaret. And he's someone that, throughout his lifetime was wrestling with that challenge that Islam poses to Christianity. Christianity often being seen by many as having a weak or compromised political vision. And a key presenting challenge to Christians and to the secular world is that sense of religion and state, din wa dunya, that true religion is realised and it is given full presence with a state that is identified with Islamic governance. And what that means for Christians and secular political theorists is I guess, at the intersection of this debate. Kenneth Cragg, who, if you've read any of his stuff, he's quite a difficult person to read. He's very eloquent, lots of difficult sentences, but quite flowery. And this is a wonderful phrase of his. He says at one point in one of his books that Christianity to many Muslims seems jejune, effete, misguided and discredited. The discredited bit, and this is the stuff that as a Christian minister I have to own up to, is that sense when we pray in the Lord's Prayer, the foundational prayer to Christians, your kingdom come, where is that kingdom? And we look around the world and we reflect on a history of Christian nations. Where was the kingdom? There is still fighting, there is still disunity, there is still poverty and injustice. And that will be that challenge of, well, you have a misguided and discredited vision of the political. And jejune and effete, I come from, if you like, a low church tradition of Christianity where a big aspect of the Christian spirituality is that sense of relationship with God, that in Christ we have forgiveness of sins, an encounter with God, and actually there's a transformation of the heart that leads to new life and the new creation that's coming. And there's an admission that a challenge from Islam to that sort of Christianity, it's effete, it's ethereal. How does that cash out? You might talk of inner transformation and a relationship with God, but unless the poor are fed, unless wars end, what does that mean? The life of God on earth surely cashes out in real terms in the public square. And an Islamic scholar, Hamidullah, directly critiquing Kenneth Cragg, I think he would summarise many Islamic critiques of Christian politics in these words: Christianity wishes to leave unto Caesar what is Caesar's. In the absence of Christian guidance, so he's saying that there's absence because we don't have frameworks that say this is what Christian politics should look like. In the absence of Christian guidance, a Christian ruler will not follow Christ but Machiavelli, whereas Islamic guidance to a ruler is as imperative as it is to one who prays and fasts. So that unity of the secular and the religious that's there in Islam. And how do Christians respond to that kind of critique? Okay, so let's look at the three theologians. This is Kenneth Cragg, is an old man. I had the privilege to meet him a few times. Someone who's very gracious and interesting, fluent in Arabic, incredibly articulate and knowledgeable about the Muslim faith. And I can't commend his book, The Call of the Minaret, more highly. I have a Muslim scholar friend who read The Call of the Minaret and said he was moved to tears by the gracious sense of holiness as he was reflecting on the Quran. So Kenneth Cragg was reading the Quran as an Arabist and finding resonances as a Christian with what it means to be holy and to follow God in that. I guess it responds to that critique of Hamidullah's about, Caesar's, where's the empire? Where's the religious impact on empire? Kenneth Cragg, one of his little phrases that's often quoted is, Muhammad was Islam's Constantine as well as its prophet. And Cragg would want to say that the Constantinian vision, so that moment where Emperor Constantine, if you like, permitted plurality in the Roman Empire and freedom of religion to Christians, which eventuated in a Christian empire with the next emperor, was a wrong turn for Christians. And actually, within Islam, the project, he describes it as the Medinan moment. The Medinan moment of Islam was when true religion was actually compromised. Because if you think that creating structures of the political, however that's done, will, if you like, finalise and make concrete the ultimate religious impulse, then that itself becomes a stopping point for true religion. So I'll put it in other terms. I've heard Kenneth Cragg say the heart cry of Islam, Allahu Akbar. Akbar is God is greater. And once you have a realised political system, God is greater becomes compromised. And worship always has to have priority over your political project. That will be a key kind of reflection of Kenneth Cragg. So actually, and this, I guess, makes him controversial, and one of the accusations to Kenneth Cragg is that he tries to Christianise the Quran. He would want to say, well, actually, the Medinan trajectory in the Quran needs to be superseded by the Meccan trajectory, and a reverse abrogation is called for. Right? Because the Meccan trajectory always prioritises worship. And once you prioritise the political, then you compromised Allahu Akbar, because you then worship your project. And he would say that was evidenced in Christianity. Christians get guilty of this. So once we have a Christian empire, Christian worship becomes compromised because people with power suddenly impose their way of doing things, and that becomes an end in itself. True religion, the impulse of religion, gets compromised when it suits the powers that be to be religious. Yeah, does that make sense? And it's interesting because Cragg, I think if you read his material over the years, and there's many years of writing, so Qawluh and Minaret came out in, 1954? He was publishing books even at the age of 98. He wrote a book on Shakespeare and the Christian faith at the age of 98. But there's a growing generosity about his reflections on political Islam. So he talks in some early literature about the contrast between creative trusteeship in the Christian faith, that humanity is a trustee of God's creation and has the freedom to, govern and implement laws and administer justice in a free, creative way. There's no definitive system imposed on that creation. And he contrasts that with the Medinan trajectory in the Quran, which he calls the custodian mind. Right? A custodian mind being one of, here's a very limited trusteeship. You must do X, Y, Z. And yet what Cragg does, particularly in his later writings, says it's still there in the Quran. You can read the Quran with that creative trusteeship in mind. And he goes to Surah 2 with the doctrine of Khilafah, that as God gives humanity, gives Adam dominion over the garden, that there's this open sense of how do you govern, how do you look after this earth? And an interesting reflection of his where he finds a resonance with the Christian understanding of God. You will know this text better than me, but the demurral of the angels who say, well, why let humanity be the caliphs of the earth? Because it's going to be a mistake. Look what they'll do with it. And that demurral for Kenneth Cragg is seen as God's risk in creation. Now, I know that may sound like a provocative phrase to use, but God chooses to restrain an element of his sovereignty by giving trusteeship of creation to humanity, knowing, if I can put it in these terms, that we'll screw it up. Yeah? That men and women, and can I say Christians and Muslims, will govern and rule and do some good things and also do some appalling things. And we are given this province to govern on behalf of God, but it's a creative trusteeship. So he talks about the divine self-limiting of human politics. And there's a lovely phrase that, as he expands on this, drawing from Surah 2, he talks about the grand perhaps of the Quran. So if you do a little word search on your, your digital Quranic copies of perhaps, the repeated perhaps in the Quran, perhaps man may, perhaps you may obey. And there's this risk, and again, provocatively used, vulnerability that God chooses as he creates the earth. Okay, so there's Bishop Kenneth Cragg. Next figure, perhaps a little more obviously known and perhaps more obviously controversial. You probably all remember or are aware of the Regensburg lecture in 2006. And it must be noted that I think many would argue that the clumsy insensitivity of that lecture, where he referred to a Byzantine emperor, Palaiologos, talking about violence within Islam and nothing good comes that's not violent within Islam. That clumsy quote, which was, yes, taken out of context, but I think showed an element of ignorance about the global stage and Christian-Muslim relations. And a key advisor who was steeped in Christian-Muslim relations had been, how can I put this politely, moved sideways to another job not long before this lecture. And so I think there was an element of a complete political own goal. But what I want to talk about is the rest of the lecture, which was largely ignored. The reactions and responses to that quote, which was very insensitive, were just one part of a lecture that was quite interesting on the issue of the political and Christianity and Islam, particularly in Europe. And what Pope Benedict was saying, and I think there is some critique to be had of him, but he was wanting to suggest that the Christian faith in Europe had found a way of synthesizing faith and reason, and was wanting to challenge the Enlightenment project and lots of post-Enlightenment political theory that would splinter faith from reason. and he was reclaiming a Christian metaphysics. Right? So do you understand what I mean when I say that? So metaphysics being the idea that there's a unified whole beyond the physical, and that through Aristotle and through the Apostle Paul, that New Testament Judeo-Christian synthesis of rationality in Aristotle was formed together within Christian civilization, and it meant that discussions about politics and violence, extremism, fundamentalism could be had in the public square. And it was as much an admission that Christian politics was getting squeezed into a private arena, that actually quite a lot of Protestant, remember Pope Benedict's a Catholic Pope, quite a lot of Protestant Christian thinking was buying into the Enlightenment idea that religion was just a private thing, and in Christian terms was just a matter of what you did on a Sunday. And actually, Christian metaphysics needed to combine faith and politics with rationality and reason. And essentially, it was an attack on religious volunteerism. He was saying it's not enough for religious groups to say, my religious text says I should do X, Y, Z. It needed to be defended rationally and reasonably. But also, pointing the other way, it was a challenge to secular theorists saying, actually, you need to wake up, religious groups are here, we will engage politically and publicly, and you can't squeeze us into, this tiny area of the private. But actually by doing that, he was both defending a Christian metaphysics and prodding Islamic theories that would countenance voluntarism. I think where I'd want to perhaps challenge, and this is the bit, and go away and search on the net and read the text for yourself. What he does, he presumes a bit too much of Christian Europe, because guess where Christians received their Aristotelian politics and political theory from? I'm sure you've learned it here. Come on. Yeah. So there were Islamic philosophers, Ibn Sina, Ibn Arabi, who were passing on Aristotelian theories, and it was Thomas Aquinas via Islamic scholars that were combining faith and reason in a European context. So I think there is a critique to be had of Pope Benedict that it was an assumption of a univocal Christian civilization in Europe, when actually it's a bit more nuanced and hybrid than that. But I think there is a critique to hear about the place of voluntarism amongst religions. And I want to say we have our own voluntarists too in the Christian faith, all right? How do we make sense of our religiously motivated actions? They've got to be plausible. Now, as a Christian, I can say that they've got to be plausible because I believe if God made this earth, being a Christian, following the way of Christ, will obviously make sense. If you like, it's following the grain of the universe. It's not an abstraction and a weirdness to be religious in Christian terms. And I believe there's a tradition within Islam that will want to say the same. So how do we have that discourse where we're able to say things that make sense for the totality of society and not just for ourselves? Okay, let's move on. Pope Benedict. And I will segue into Rowan Williams by, and this is my third character, third theologian, by telling a story that Rowan Williams has told, which kind of illustrates this point in a different way. And you might need a couple of moments, and again, Rowan Williams is another difficult speaker, difficult writer, but once you get into his way of thinking, I think very rich. You might need a moment to think through why this is funny, but it is a funny story. He tells a story about citizenship in Europe and being a Christian citizen. And he quotes a Romanian government minister under Ceausescu. So at the communist era, so President Ceausescu, a regime that was a totalitarian, extreme version of communism, even within the Soviet bloc at the time. And there was this government minister called Anna Parkour, and Rowan Williams begins a lecture by talking of Anna Parkour walking the streets of Bucharest. This would be in the early 80s, and it's a fine spring day, but she's carrying an umbrella. And somebody asked her, "Why are you carrying an umbrella?" And her reply was, "Well, it's raining in Moscow." And Rowan Williams, yeah, you can pause and smile at least at some point. And Rowan Williams, what he's saying by that, he's wanting to acknowledge that people of faith have a primary allegiance elsewhere, right? And those of us in this room would probably agree that actually I'm not primarily British or English or even Lancastrian. I'm primarily a Christian. That's where my ultimate first allegiance lies. And this is a biblical term. There in the epistles, St. Paul uses it, St. Peter uses it. My identity is as a Christian citizen. Muslims would want to say something similar. And yet, and this is the interesting bit of the mildly amusing story about Anna Parkour in Romania, sometimes us religious folk can do things that call our allegiance elsewhere, but actually they're nonsensical and they're ridiculous. So for Anna Parkour to carry an umbrella because it's raining in Moscow, what on earth good is that? And I guess that's something of that sense of what does it mean to be people of God in a world, and this is Kenneth Cragg language, that is sacramental, that makes sense because God has made it so. Okay, let's move to Rowan Williams. I want to reflect particularly on his Sharia law speech, and again, controversial, and he got it from all corners. So I've read articles and lectures that, both from, the coverage that he got in the tabloid press was obscene and ridiculous. They clearly not read it for a start, possibly and probably not even understood it, but that's understandable too. But also from some Muslims, because what he did in many ways, he was speaking on behalf of and drew a bit of a lens to the Muslim community, and I think it wasn't always helpful. Created an issue that perhaps wasn't there or wasn't necessarily wanted. But just to reflect on his thinking, his political theology as a Christian. And there's quite an interesting background and history and context to the essence of his speech, because he was drawing from a number of Christian thinkers from the beginning of the 20th century. Somebody in particular called Neville Figgis, who was an Anglican religious, someone who had taken vows of a religious order. And Neville Figgis was a Christian socialist who wrote about the primacy of associations. And you must remember that in political theory terms, the dominant way of thinking at that time, and still in many quarters, was idealism, Hegelian idealism. So the idea that nation states have a character, and this is the kind of stuff that was built on by both Marxism and fascism in terms of dialectic thinking, that that nations would have their ups and downs and encounter certain crises, and Marxism used it in one way in terms of national characters leading towards a crisis of revolution, and fascism went another way in terms of national characters establishing a particular way of being and even ethnic identity. And what Rowan Williams was doing was drawing from Neville Figgis, who was a minority voice in Christian terms in the early 20th century, who was saying, well, actually, the state is a pretty modern invention in terms of history. And let's not invest too much in what the state is. And the reality of what governs and shapes real life and freedoms are corporations and associations. So for Neville Figgis, it was cooperative groups, local political groups, and actually let them have powers and freedoms, because at that level, and at the level of family and neighbourhoods, that's when actually lots of substantive political life is realised. And it's a debate that some of the contemporary thinkers, and I'm going to be careful here using this because it's not how the Tories have used it, but when we talk of big society, some of the political theories behind that are wanting to draw from this tradition. So it's about localism. It's about challenging the, here's a good phrase, the omnicompetent state. And Rowan Williams is saying, hey, the state is no big shakes. It's not gonna answer all our problems. And let's look at religious communities, and specifically let's look at Islam, who they have laws, and it's a practical reality that those laws will shape how certain things happen in the community. In Britain, we've got growing religious plurality. Let the state leave some of that alone, or at least permit some of those laws to be licensed in our courts. What he wasn't saying, and this was the tabloid critique, is everything goes. It's Sharia in every street in Sparkbrook where I am. He wasn't saying that. He was saying, let's have a conversation about how our different communities might more freely express religion in political and public life. And it's in exploring some of the limits of that that we will find out and learn and actually realise greater religious freedom. So even in having the conversation, it might be that some, and I've read Islamic feminist critiques of the Sharia law lecture, it might be that some divorce laws within Sharia law courts are circumscribed because of commitments in Britain to equality of gender. But actually having those conversations, what he calls pragmatic pluralism, is how we'll get a greater public presence of religion, because the state is not the thing that realises religion in public life. Okay, so where are we? Done 3. Let me give you some conclusions, then we can have some discussion and a bit of free-for-all on this, because it's quite a fertile area, and there's probably lots of things I've said that you'll think, oh, not sure about that, and it'd be great to have some discussion. It would be worth stating that each of the three voices that I've outlined, Kenneth Cragg, Pope Benedict, and Rowan Williams, all three would support a classic understanding of what we call Augustinian political theology, the doctrine of the two, that religious leaders should never be the same as political leaders. And that's not because, and this is, keen to stress this is not American separation of state and religion. Now, that's not the same thing as classic Augustinian political theory, right? I believe, and these three theologians believe, that religion should affect politics. There are two spheres, the secular, and in St. Augustine terms, the secular is the temporal, the stuff that's going to, if you like, die, the seculum in Latin. And the other area is the city, the two cities in St. Augustine's writings. The other area is the eternal and the temporal. And there's an overlapping area in our public life. The thing is, we don't always know which is eternal and which is temporal, because, in Christian terms, humans get it wrong. And even Christians, and even churches, do bad things. So there's this overlapping area. And leaders of churches shouldn't dictate the political, but they will influence and argue and challenge. If they take over the political, then actually going back to Cragg, they've become a Constantine, and that straight away compromises a religious impulse. And again, the secular has influence over the religious. So I, as a Christian minister, have to follow CRB regulations and do things in terms of church employees that follow the law, but it's not total. And certainly there should be no influence of how I preach on a Sunday from the Prime Minister, for example. So there are these two spheres, but they're not discrete spheres. And just to pose three reflections or questions. In Britain, we just have the pragmatics of diversity. There's the reality of different religious groups. How do we articulate a religious basis for plurality? All three of those, in quite different ways, would want to give a Christian metaphysics that says it is okay for a public square to have different religions and people of no religion contributing and punching their weight there. The challenge back to Islam: give us an Islamic basis for plurality. There's a realism about human experience. How do religious political theologies take account of the temptations and corruptions of power? And I've got to kind of hold my hands up and say, in Christian history, we have both been quietists, gone along with privatized Sunday Christianity, that's not good enough, but also being compromised by power, crusades, Inquisition, you name it. How do we account for the realities that we'll get it wrong? And the challenge to Islam: give me the perfect society on earth that's ever been. In experience in history, a Christian would say, we ain't going to get it. And how do faith groups avoid the privatization of religious practice while making sense to the other? So, how do we stop being Anna Parkour with our umbrella up when it's not raining? We can have faith as a conversation starter or stopper. And I think there is something, it's incumbent on us to make sense in some way, which isn't to say that we'll always be heard. that will always be accepted. But I think there's something about a metaphysics of rationality, of natural law, where we should be able to argue in some way, and yes, use religious language, but unless it's seen to be for the good of all, is it truly faithful? I'll stop there. Fire away.
Thank you very much. First, we should say thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe a round of applause. So I think there's some very, very interesting issues you've raised, and I think many things that people are deeply engaged with discussing here, actually. So we can open up for questions, and I guess you're happy for comments as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Please, Thomas, tell us.
Hello, Reverend.
Hello.
I want to ask about, I believe your colleague Roy Gaston is for the interfaith matters. I want to ask about the Queen's Foundation, the interfaith training that has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Ray is a colleague of mine. And we work together on quite a bit of the interfaith issues. And Queen's, for those that don't know, is a college that trains Christian ministers from several denominations: Church of England, Methodist, some Black Pentecostal denominations, and everyone trained for public ministry in the denominations through Queen's will get interfaith teaching, will have experiences, input from Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Jewish scholars, teachers and leaders, will visit other places of worship. And you know, we're committed that to be a Christian minister in Britain today, you need to know something about other faiths. So, I mean, Ray has, I think, led the way in really integrating that into the syllabus. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can give a question to get people going. I had a genuine question, actually. When you mentioned the Pope Benedict's trying to temper voluntarism in Christianity, and more broadly maybe in religion, so is voluntarism a bigger issue for Protestants than Catholics? Because I have some confusion there, because I mean, if Protestants on one hand, they're more akin to a level of secularity than Catholics, but obviously the tradition of Aquinas and rationality is a Catholic tradition.
That's
so
right.
If you could elaborate on that,
Yeah.
very interesting.
That's a very good question. I think if you asked a Catholic would say that one of the downsides of the Reformation was it opened the door for this split of faith and reason. Because of the emphasis of the individual response of faith, that it fostered a privatization of religion. So, you know, one of the great kind of Reformation motifs was to the sources, ad fons in Latin. So giving the freedom to, you know, read the scriptures in your own language and then be able to say to the priest, you're wrong. It doesn't say that there. That actually that inevitably led to that process of a bifurcation of religion and politics, because people were doing their own thing. That would be a classic Catholic response. A Protestant response would be, and you know, so Pope Benedict is wanting, when he describes Christian Europe, he's referring to Catholic Europe. And there's an Anglican political theologian called John Milbank who uses the same language, but he would be an Anglo-Catholic, wanting to draw from that same tradition. A Protestant response would be, well, there's a voluntarism within Catholicism because there's an element of superstition classically, because you just do what the priest says. And so I think voluntarism can come in different guises, can't it? And I think at heart, it's a denial of that human trusteeship. So, you know, the language of Cragg, what's it again, of custodian mind. A custodian mind would say, well, I will just do what the priest tells me to, regardless of my sense of spiritual life and encounter with God. Equally, an evangelical Protestant, perhaps classically in the American model, you know, if the Bible says, and you know, you'll have seen on the news a couple of weeks ago, a Pentecostal pastor in Texas died from a rattlesnake bite. Yeah. And he died from rattlesnake bite because there is a verse in the New Testament talking about those Christians that, I mean, Jesus says, those that follow after me, they will do even greater things, that snakes will bite them and they will not be harmed. And so there is a strange sect in southern United States where in their worship services they will handle rattlesnakes. And it's bizarre, and a pastor died of a snake bite. It's volunteerism. They've read the text literally and just assumed that without using their rational mind, without connecting with tradition and the practices over the years, that somehow that's religious obedience. So I think, you know, that will be a custodian mind again from the other end of things. So, you know, creative trusteeship. How do each of us read our texts, be accountable to God, work with our communities of tradition, connect with the world as it is, with science and learning?
Surely, I mean, the challenge, you said that, for example, that religious people have to kind of bring some sense into the actions or reason. And you give the example then later on of the lady with the umbrella. Surely she could have been putting the umbrella to take care of her complexion, you know, instead of the rain.
Sure, yes.
So what I'm trying to say is that it's a kind of a slippery slope. How do you judge, you know, what a person is doing, what the reason behind what they're doing?
Now, that's a really good point, and I think I would want to say with difficulty, and that's, for me, that would be something that comes across very much in Rowan Williams' political theology. This isn't an easy process, and I mean, he's been described as having an agonistic political theology. It's agonized. You know, there's no ready-made formula, and so, you know, what may seem ridiculous could actually make a lot of sense once you go under the surface and have a conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
But it still could be ridiculous.
Yeah.
So you've got to have the conversation. So you've got to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
No, I was agreeing. I'm saying it is in many cases. Like even in our tradition, you see it all the time. Like, it is. I was, by the way, just comment in the beginning when you were talking about Craig's opinion on the Medinan trajectory and the Meccan trajectory. I found that really, really interesting. That and it's a discussion we were having the other day about this sort of reverse abrogation, and how this polity that came in during the Medinan time maybe it's a bit simplistic to see it just as abrogation. I mean, that can be really harsh. Maybe even in Medina, the principles that were used to set up the state had something to give us, but maybe to be interpreted in a different way for a different time. Does he take sort of that into account? Does he look at changing things about rather than just abrogating?
Yes, I mean, it's a motif. It's a phrase that he uses. That, I mean, what he's not doing is saying, well, actually, you ignore all those surahs out of Medina. He's not saying that, but clearly, where there's a will to power, or where there's a problematic about plurality. So, classically the treatment of the people of the book in Mecca as opposed to in Medina, which do you reverse? I guess I would say you reverse the Medinan account there. And he gets accused of Christianizing because, and I think there's, and this is where I think it's a creative conversation that gets really interesting, because there is a danger that neuters Islamic politics. And I wouldn't want to neuter Islamic politics. I'm not here to say that Islam should be can I put it in this terms, a Friday thing. But I would want to say it needs to encompass a plural thing.
Yeah, it may purify action in practice. It might neuter politically, but
On personal levels, it might have the opposite effect.
Just actually commenting on that, just to mention Muhammad Taha, right? The second messenger of Islam. I don't know, maybe he might refer to that, maybe you're familiar with it. Who, if I'm not mistaken, so I think he identifies the Meccan verses as establishing the essence of the religion, and then the Medinan verses relating to an application of that to a particular context.
Yeah.
So then perhaps the mistake that's been made is reading them both as being almost essential.
Yeah.
You need to look at one as essential and look at one as an application to that context, in which case you can still try and identify the same essence which is there in the Meccan verses, but it's just
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would tie in with Craig's thinking, is that within Mecca you do get the essence of religion. It's the emphasis on rejecting idolatry, and that's the foundation of an obedient response to God, that there is no other God, and that Medina has to be contextualised in some way. And I think it's interesting, as somebody like, again, perhaps controversial but interesting, somebody like Farid Isak, who gives, he's not rejecting Medinan accounts, but he is contextualising to give a liberation theology, which I think is interesting. But Craig was one of those first voices. It's back in the mid-1950s he was engaging with this stuff.
Another point about the question. You said trying to ground everything in reason. That's a common distinction we have in the theological texts between rational, irrational, and non-rational. That sort of grouping of the group of things which you can't back up by reason, but they're not directly opposed to reason either. And do we, from what you're saying, it seemed like, don't we need to just tackle that head on and just say, look, this is faith, this is kind of what faith is. There's some things which you can't ground in reason, and we're not going to attempt. Fine, we'll try and we I guess depending on the theological school, we would say that there can't be anything irrational, or there can't be anything which is totally supposed to be absurd. But there's other things which we just, that. Otherwise, why is it called faith anyway? What's a number of responses to that, and a really, really great point, because, and I think this is why it's agonistic. St Anselm, who was an early Archbishop of Canterbury, he talked about faith in pursuit of understanding. And so our first response is one of faith, actually, but the theological task, in Christian terms, a discipleship task, or in Islamic terms, following the path of obedience, of learning, leads to understanding. So there's a metaphysics that it will make sense, but it's always in process. So, that in the Bible, St. Paul talks about the cross as this foundational moment for the Christian faith that gives us salvation, redemption, but talks about it as foolishness.
So even written in the heart of the Christian faith is something irrational. But I think what I'd want to say, and I mean there's a Catholic theologian that talks about the common good, which is, I think, tied in with rationality and natural law. He talks about the common good as being heuristic. And I think I'd want to say the same thing about rationality. So it's, when I say heuristic, it's discovered in process, right? So I don't think we can get to the ends of rationality and say definitively that is always reasonable and that is always unreasonable. But there are things that we can say irrational and unreasonable. And some of those things connect with science and learning. You know? So can I say this? We are being filmed. Can I say it's irrational to believe that the world was created in 6 days?
Yeah, if you can eventually believe that day is something is the creation of the universe.
Yeah, I mean,
But then again, it depends on your definition of a day, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
yeah, but it's irrational to believe in a literal.
Yeah.
Yeah, a day being defined as the
creation.
rotation of the Earth being a part of the universe.
But this understanding you talk about, sorry.
No, please.
I mean, that faith takes us towards this understanding. But I guess the danger is the more we insist on this partnership of rationality and faith, the more you reduce the value of faith. Because if it's rational, then it's something we could have achieved without having religion.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think the faith in pursuit of understanding, we actually find that faith and understanding, at the end of the day, we're always one.
Rational understanding.
Yes, yeah. But when at that moment of, well, if you've always been a Muslim, then it will be perhaps a different understanding. But I don't want to presume my faith on yours, but there are moments when one feels full of faith, I would say, as a Christian, when it's, wow, that I would do anything for God. That sense of transcendence, of spirituality, which defies rationality, but in retrospect, absolutely makes sense. So I think they're completely, I don't believe that faith occurs in a vacuum. Faith is as much what we do and how we behave in our politics. But again, it's this process of learning and discovery, because this world is made by God, infused by something of God's life. I mean, that's that Christian understanding of the sacramental. I think there can be an Islamic reading of that.
Which eventually may transcend the world, transcend.
Kelly, we'll just see if anybody else has got any questions. Say it right, please. Feel free. I'm learning. Yeah. Go on, please.
I was just going to comment that at the same time, despite trying to emphasize that there is a grey area perhaps where say we can't understand because of the incomplete information set.
Yeah.
There is pressure to try and get rid of that grey area because of trying to reclaim the religion from extremism. I think it's almost like there seems to be a little bit of reaction whereby people are like, well, look, if you say there's some stuff that doesn't need to be grounded in reason, then everything's okay. And that's you're kind of playing into the hand of the extremist, and you're trying to kind of remove space for that kind of non-reason based.
I think I'd want to put it in different terms, not as leaving a grey area that might not make sense or is irrational, but to talk of mystery, and fundamentalists hate mystery in all our faiths. And I think, Christians have, through the centuries, I think I mean, there could be another lecture on doctrine of God, which would be really interesting, how we reflect on that as Christians and Muslims. And Christians sometimes have not expressed a sufficiently rigorous account of our understanding of God, and the Islamic challenge of Tawhid to Christianity is sometimes very well placed. And if we believe in one God, God is wholly other. God is ultimately transcendent. And I mean, there's a Catholic theologian that defined theology, and I know that's a Christian word in many ways, but you know, now have Islamic theologies, but take it if you want it, if you can own it. His definition of theology is the study of nothing, which is actually quite profound when you think about it. The study of no thing. God is not a thing. God is not another item in the universe. God is not, and I'm using Islamic nots, but there's a Christian tradition, the apophatic tradition of negatives in order to understand who God is. You know, God is not a bigger version of human beings, right? And so any worship, anything of faith has to have mystery. We don't know. And therefore, faith seeking understanding.
I had a question. I'm sorry if it's not particularly well phrased, but have any of the Christian theologians that you've looked at, and perhaps others, kind of addressed the question of how does it kind of, modern Christianity, which is kind of relatively capable of adjusting to living in a secular society and relatively capable of privatizing itself, how it responds to Islam to a form of Islam that many people would say can never really be properly privatized, is already always political.
Well, I mean, that I think in essence was what Rowan Williams was trying to reflect on. So, you know, very much rooting it in my context in Spark Brook, where there are some there are Sharia law courts, and there are family decisions, financial arrangements that don't go to British law courts, but they're decided by Islamic legal means. And that's just a fact. That's happening. And Rowan Williams was saying, you know, that there is this robust, actual fact, political presence amongst us. He would want to say, in Christian terms, the state is not the be-all and end-all, and is not the great giver of religious freedoms. What it can do is get in the way of religious freedoms. Is there a place for a discussion about which bits of these religious laws should be acknowledged and not acknowledged in the legal system? He was creating that conversation from a Christian theology of pluralism, that there is a basis to say, well, actually, I mean, he's coming from not just a Christian theology of political pluralism, as opposed to idealism, but also coming from a philosophical commitment. So he would be a classic Wittgensteinian theologian. Do I need to unpack what I mean by that? Okay. So Wittgenstein, very difficult philosopher, but if you boil it down into a nutshell, I mean, several quotes of his are worth knowing, and then you don't need to read his books, which are really complicated and difficult. Yeah, don't bother. But here are the quotes that summarise his later thinking. he wrote some stuff which kind of aphorisms, little phrases that explored philosophy. All cultures are language games, right? That's a classic one. So we say what we believe by what we do in community. So Rowan Williams has a commitment to that way of thinking because he's saying there are these traditioned realities around us that we don't understand by just reading about their doctrine, because they do things. You know, they wear particular clothes and they have particular laws that govern divorce. It's religion as and cultures as language games. Another quote, if lions could learn how to speak, we'd still not be able to understand them. It's a great quote. And it's basically saying different religions and worldviews, they're incommensurable. We don't make sense to each other because we've got these tradition behaviours. And what Rowan Williams is wanting to say is that, committed to that Wittgensteinian philosophy as well as his theology, is that these differences and actually enlightenment and lots of Western secular liberalism tries to lead the difference and say there's a common core. Religious people, this is what they should do, right? They do this funny religious thing, and they might eat some strange food, and they might dress in a particular way, and they go to a particular place, and they have certain religious leaders. And that's a complete travesty and minimalisation of the religious impulse. And we are strange to each other. And he's saying, let's get a conversation going. We're responsible to each other, and in that conversation, we'll find freedoms fostered as we try and learn these language games.
Thank you. Can I ask a final question? Unless you. No. I wonder how, without adopting that form of life, the conversation could happen. So still we end up with the separate society, communities, different form of life.
I think, this is the big challenge to Rowan Williams' thinking. What do you do, this pragmatic pluralism, if the other party, the other group, doesn't want to come to the table? That's the blind.
The legitimacy of your form of life.
Well, I mean, I think for me, the cashing out of this in practical reality is getting involved in stuff for the common good. So
I want to show the Kantian foundation of his Wittgensteinian thought.
Oh, right.
He presupposes a type of common good accepted by all, so they can communicate. So he's using Wittgenstein, still working with a Kantian film.
Well, I don't think Rowan Williams is working with a Kantian understanding, because he's saying, he's not saying that you'll always work out what the common good is and that you will always understand. He's saying we are essentially strange to each other, but we have to try and have those conversations. We have to work at this stuff. And the Christian underpinning and the metaphysics is that, well, particularly with Christianity and Islam, there is a sense of universalism. We both have universalistic faiths. We believe that this way of life is what the whole of humanity is called to. And so, even in that admission, there's something that you can have a conversation about. If the whole of humanity should live this way, then you can begin to talk about why it might be good. You still might disagree, it still might be alien, but in that process of conversation, you're going to get further along the way. And Rowan Williams isn't giving us a final project. Oh, it's going to look like this at the end of the day. It is heuristic. It is in process. But I think he would most decidedly not be Kantian. Yeah.
Any further comment?
Thank you.
No. I think we thank you very, very much. Genuinely, I enjoyed it very, very much. Learned a huge amount. I think look at everybody's faces, they did as well. Okay, so hopefully you will honour us by coming back and
Love to.
spending more time with us and building towards these types of conversations.
Thank you.
Forward, So maybe again another round of applause.